The grand palace was a sight to behold. Every corner was adorned with intricate designs. The floors gleamed with polish and the walls seemed to hum with the weight of history. It was a place where royalty, dignitaries and leaders from around the world gathered, each more eager than the last to make their mark, to be seen, and to feel the weight of power in their hands. On this particular evening, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, was the guest of honor. As he entered the lavish hall, his eyes took in the gold and marble surroundings, the crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling like diamonds in the sky. A low murmur of conversations filled the air, with diplomats and royals mingling, exchanging pleasantries and discussing matters of politics, economics, and influence. Putin, however, moved with the same deliberate pace as always, his eyes sharp and focused, scanning the room for anyone he needed to engage with. He had attended countless events like this, each one offering its own unique set of challenges. But this one felt different. There was something almost heavy in the atmosphere, a tension in the air that wasn't entirely about the grandeur of the setting or the importance of the people around him. It was something deeper, something he couldn't quite place, but it made him feel on edge. As he walked past a row of stately guards, his steps slowed. These were no ordinary guards. Their uniforms were impeccably pressed, their postures stiff and unyielding. They stood like statues, frozen in place, their eyes fixed forward, alert to any movement or sound. The silence around them was absolute, broken only by the distant clinking of glasses or the rustling of silk gowns. Among these figures stood one royal guard in particular who caught Putin's eye. The man was young, perhaps no older than 25, with a square jaw and the kind of discipline that seemed ingrained in every muscle. His uniform was pristine, his back straight, and his gaze unwavering. In a room full of movers and shakers, the guard stood as still and silent as a rock, untouched by the flurry of activity around him. Putin's gaze lingered on the guard for a moment. There was something about him that felt different. Most of the time, Putin was used to people moving aside when he approached, offering a respectful nod or even a gesture of deference. But this guard, this man, seemed untouched by any notion of reverence or respect. He stood there absolutely still, as though he had no concern for who walked by or how powerful they might be. As Putin drew nearer, he could sense the eyes of the room shifting, watching this small exchange closely. They were all waiting to see what would happen next. The weight of the moment was becoming more apparent with each passing second, and Putin could feel his pulse quicken. He wasn't the type to let such things slide. If he was going to be in a place like this, he expected respect. He wasn't just any leader, he was the leader of a great nation, and he would make sure that everyone understood that. Without thinking too much, Putin slowed his pace and turned toward the young guard. His voice, low but firm, cut through the hum of conversation. "Step aside," Putin ordered, his tone commanding. He was used to having his commands followed without question. "You're blocking my path." The guard didn't move. His posture remained perfect, his eyes still locked ahead. There was no hint of hesitation, no sign of fear or respect. It was as if Putin had said nothing at all. The silence stretched between them, almost thick enough to be felt, and it did not escape Putin's attention. For a brief moment he felt his control slipping. There was no movement, no response. And in that silence he felt a small but sharp ripple of unease. The guard's stillness seemed deliberate, a quiet defiance in the face of authority. This wasn't the way things were supposed to unfold. Putin's eyes narrowed slightly, his lips pressing together into a thin line. His mind raced, analyzing the situation. This was not normal. Guards, whether royal or military, were trained to respond quickly and respectfully to the commands of those who outranked them. But this guard, this man, was different. Was it a test? Was it intentional? "Did you hear me?" Putin asked, his voice now rising just a touch, more insistent, but the guard remained unmoved. No word, no acknowledgement. He was still. The moment stretched on, and Putin felt his own presence in the room start to shift. The crowd seemed to grow quieter, sensing the building tension. Putin wasn't used to being ignored, and certainly not by someone so young and seemingly insignificant. After all, what power did a guard have compared to the leader of a nation? The silence that followed his second command was almost deafening. The room, once filled with murmurs, seemed to hold its breath. Even the most seasoned diplomats, who had witnessed their fair share of power plays, looked on in curious silence. There was something in the air now that couldn't be ignored. The guard's unyielding silence felt like a statement in itself. It wasn't an outburst of disrespect, nor was it an act of rebellion. It was simply a refusal to bend, a refusal to be moved, to be swayed by the weight of any individual's power. It was a silent message that spoke louder than any words Putin could have said. Putin's gaze sharpened. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged like this, especially not in public. He had faced political rivals, adversaries, and competitors, but this was different. It wasn't a direct challenge. It wasn't even an argument. It was a refusal to react, a refusal to be part of the performance of power that had been carefully orchestrated in this grand room. And in that refusal, the young guard had exposed something deeper, something that Putin could not easily ignore. For a split second, Putin stood there, his mind racing, trying to make sense of it. Should he raise his voice further? Should he take a step forward and demand compliance? Should he call for an official reprimand? But as he stood there, watching the guard's unwavering composure, something unexpected happened. A shift in the air, a soft click in his mind. He realized that despite his position, his rank, and his reputation, there were moments when power did not need to be expressed through words. There were times when silence, when strength of character could speak more profoundly than any command. As the moment stretched on, Putin's irritation began to wane, replaced by something quieter. A grudging respect, perhaps. The guard had not moved an inch, but in that stillness he had communicated more than anyone else in the room. The power of his silence was louder than any word could have been. The crowd around them continued to watch, still uncertain of how this strange interaction would unfold. But for Putin, the significance of the moment was clear. This was no longer just about who held the power in that room. It was about the unspoken strength that could not be easily shaken, a strength that came not from loud commands, but from the quiet assurance of one man standing his ground. The silence between Putin and the royal guard seemed to stretch on for what felt like an eternity. The air had thickened, and the room, once filled with polite chatter and the sounds of clinking glasses, now seemed to hold its breath. Even the most practiced diplomats, who had seen power plays and delicate negotiations unfold countless times, were momentarily stunned. What was happening? What would Putin do? For Putin, this moment was an uncomfortable one. He wasn't used to being ignored. As the leader of a powerful nation, he was accustomed to people stepping aside when he walked by, to guards saluting and acknowledging his presence with military precision. In this grand palace, surrounded by some of the most influential figures in the world, the royal guard's refusal to engage felt like a slap in the face. The tension in the room was palpable, and Putin's mind was racing. His first instinct was to escalate the situation. He had been in numerous situations where his authority was challenged, and each time he had used his power to silence the challenger. But this was different. This was not an argument or a dispute over policy. This was not about diplomacy or a political maneuver. This was a young man standing at attention, refusing to acknowledge him. The silence wasn't loud in the way that a shout would be, but it was heavy with meaning. Putin stood there for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the guard's expressionless face. The young man's gaze was locked ahead, his posture unshaken and his demeanor calm. There was no sign of fear in his eyes, no hint of uncertainty. It was as if he wasn't even aware of the weight of Putin's gaze bearing down on him. His unwavering stillness was almost surreal, like a piece of stone carved from marble, unmoved by time or pressure. The people around them were starting to shift uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of this strange standoff. Others were whispering under their breath, wondering what was going to happen next. But the most interesting thing of all was that, in the face of this awkward silence, there was something strangely powerful about the guard's refusal to react. It wasn't out of defiance in the way that one might expect from a challenger. No, it was a quiet, calculated silence that spoke volumes. Putin, the master of control and authority, began to feel a subtle sense of discomfort, a tightening in his chest. It wasn't fear. He didn't fear the young guard, but there was something about the guard's complete lack of reaction that unsettled him. In his world, power was exercised through action, through words, through commands that were expected to be followed. But this guard had thrown that formula out the window. His power was in his refusal to play along with the usual dance of authority. Putin shifted his weight slightly, looking around the room. The crowd was still, but their collective awareness was growing. They were watching, waiting to see how this moment would unfold. In a way, the silence between Putin and the guard had become a public performance, a test of wills between the two men. The question on everyone's mind was, who would break first? Who would give in to the pressure, to the tension that was mounting in the air? Putin felt a sharp flicker of frustration. He was the president of Russia. He had led his country through countless political storms, had faced down opponents both domestic and foreign, and had never been questioned like this. And yet, here he was, standing before a single guard who had not moved an inch in response to his orders. It was as if the young man was a force unto himself, impervious to the usual methods of intimidation and command. The more Putin tried to process the situation, the more he realized that this wasn't just a matter of authority. It was a matter of control, the guard's control over himself. While Putin had been raised in an environment where power was exerted through outward displays of force, the guard had demonstrated a completely different kind of power, the power of silence. In the stillness, something began to shift inside Putin. He had spent his entire life mastering the art of command, of bending people to his will with nothing more than a look or a word. But now, for the first time in a long while, he was faced with something he couldn't control. The young guard's silence was a force of its own, a calm and quiet strength that pushed back against the world of loud orders and forceful gestures that Putin inhabited. As the tension stretched on, Putin could feel his irritation growing. His pride was wounded. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to bend people to his will, on his sharpness, on his ability to lead through sheer strength. But here in this room, in the face of this young man's unflinching stillness, all of that felt meaningless. What could he do? How could he regain control of the situation? The answer was elusive. At that moment, something unexpected happened. Putin realized that there was nothing he could do. There would be no grand gesture, no forceful command that would shake the guard from his position. The silence had taken on a life of its own, and in that quiet, the power dynamics had subtly shifted. The room, once alive with the sounds of conversation and laughter, now seemed to hang in limbo. Everyone was waiting for Putin to respond, waiting for the guard to break. But the silence spoke louder than anything else, and yet, there was an odd sense of respect that began to grow within Putin. He had never been one to easily give respect, especially not to someone who seemed so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But there was something undeniably impressive about the guard's composure. He wasn't just standing there because he had to. He wasn't waiting for permission to move. He was simply being, as if he had no need to prove anything to anyone. The longer Putin stood there, the more he realized that the guard wasn't simply refusing to respond. He was refusing to be part of the game that was usually played in these high-stakes political environments. The young guard was not intimidated by Putin's power, and in that refusal to be intimidated, he had taken control of the situation in a way that no one else in the room had done. His silence was not an act of rebellion, but a statement of his own self-assurance. The more Putin reflected on it, the more he saw the brilliance in it. In that brief silent exchange, the guard had taught him a lesson. Power was not always about speaking loudest, making demands, or asserting one's dominance through force. Sometimes power was about control of one's actions, control of one's emotions, and control over the situation itself. The guard had shown him that true strength came not from command but from the ability to remain unmoved, unaffected, and unyielding. Putin stood there, his mind racing. The guard had done nothing except stand still, but in that stillness, he had captured Putin's attention and in doing so, had shown him a different kind of power, a power that Putin had not encountered often, but one that left a lasting impression. Putin stood there, his mind racing. The seconds seemed to stretch endlessly, each moment filled with an internal struggle that he couldn't easily escape. For someone who had spent his entire life learning how to assert control over every situation, this was uncharted territory. He was used to being the one in charge, the one whose words carried weight, whose presence demanded attention. But now, standing before this young royal guard, he felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation, a feeling of being uncertain, almost out of place. The silence between them seemed to grow heavier, each second passing like a beat in a slow, tense rhythm. Putin's eyes narrowed as he watched the guard. His posture remained unchanged, perfect, stoic, and resolute. There was no sign of movement, no flicker of emotion, no acknowledgement that Putin's presence even mattered. The young man stood tall, his gaze fixed ahead, as if the world around him didn't exist. It was as though he were a part of the palace itself, unmovable and untouchable, a fixture in a place of power that could not be shifted by any force. For a brief moment, Putin wondered if he had made a mistake. In his position, he was accustomed to being surrounded by people who were quick to respond, quick to show deference. He was used to having things go his way with just a look or a gesture. But now this guard's complete stillness was forcing him to confront something that he hadn't had to deal with in years. His own vulnerability. It was a strange feeling for someone like Putin. He had always prided himself on his ability to navigate any situation, to bend people to his will through charm, force, or sheer persistence. But now, facing this guard's unwavering composure, he was questioning everything he thought he knew about power and authority. What good were commands and demands if the person in front of you didn't even acknowledge your presence? What good was power if it couldn't move someone who stood perfectly still? In the quiet of the moment, Putin's mind began to unravel. He tried to reason with himself. Surely this was just a test. This guard was testing his patience, testing his authority. That had to be it. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't a typical challenge. It wasn't a confrontation that could be solved with a display of force or power. This was something deeper, something that made him question the very foundation of how he operated. Putin's leadership had always been built on control. Control over his people, control over situations, control over outcomes. He had learned early on that to lead effectively, one had to appear unshakable, unmovable, and always in command. His public image had been carefully crafted over decades to reflect a man who was decisive, strong, and resolute. But standing in front of this young guard, he realized that control could also be a form of restraint. This guard wasn't being defiant in the traditional sense. He wasn't shouting or demanding attention. He wasn't challenging Putin's authority with words or actions. He was simply standing there, and in doing so, he was silently denying Putin's power. The more Putin thought about it, the more the complexity of the situation unfolded in his mind. This guard wasn't simply resisting him. He was resisting the very concept of power as Putin had always understood it. In the world Putin inhabited, power was exercised through action, through visible force. Leaders who commanded respect did so through their ability to act decisively and forcefully. But this guard was demonstrating something different, a kind of power that didn't require movement, didn't require words, didn't require anything at all. And that was what made it so difficult for Putin to comprehend. In his experience, silence was a weakness, something that could be filled with uncertainty or hesitation. But the guard's silence was not uncertain. It wasn't a sign of weakness. It was strong, deliberate, and complete. It was a silence that didn't seek approval or acknowledgement. It was the silence of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. As the silence lingered, Putin began to feel an unfamiliar tension in his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt as if he were losing control. It was subtle at first, a creeping feeling of frustration and confusion, but it quickly grew. His sharp, calculated mind searched for an answer, a solution, a way to break the stillness and regain the dominance he had always relied on. But every attempt to figure it out only seemed to deepen the mystery. The more he tried to analyze the situation, the more he realized that the power dynamics had shifted without him even noticing. The room around them remained still, as if everyone present were holding their breath. The diplomats, the royals, the servants. All eyes were on this peculiar moment, wondering what would happen next. The tension was so thick that it almost felt tangible, but no one dared to speak, as if they too understood the gravity of the situation. Even the usual hum of hushed conversations had been replaced with a heavy silence that mirrored the one between Putin and the guard. Putin's thoughts began to circle back to his upbringing. He had been taught to value strength above all else, to be decisive, to act swiftly, and to never show weakness. He had learned that control was the key to leadership, that the one who controlled the situation controlled everything. But this guard's silence was a kind of control that Putin had never considered. It was a control of self, a refusal to be moved by anything outside of his own convictions, and that was what set him apart from everyone else in the room. For a moment, Putin considered walking away. He could simply leave, walk past the guard, and continue on with the event, pretending that this exchange had never happened. But something inside him pushed back against that idea. He wasn't used to retreating, to letting something unresolved linger. If there was one thing that Putin knew, it was that unresolved situations rarely remained that way for long. They had a way of coming back to haunt you when you least expected it. So instead of walking away, Putin found himself standing there, silently processing the scene. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of the silence, trying to regain control. He realized that the more he tried to force the situation into his usual framework of power, the more futile it seemed. The guard was not playing by the same rules. He was creating his own space, his own set of dynamics, and Putin was powerless to change that. In that moment of quiet reflection, Putin came to a surprising realization. Sometimes, true strength wasn't about dominating every situation. It wasn't about always being in control, always having the last word. Sometimes strength was about having the courage to stand still, to not be moved by external pressures. The guard, in his unwavering silence, had shown Putin that there was a kind of power in restraint, in not rushing to fill the silence with words or actions. As the seconds ticked by, Putin's frustration began to fade, replaced by a sense of quiet respect for the guard. In that simple act of standing still, the young man had forced Putin to rethink his entire approach to power and leadership. It was a humbling realization, one that Putin would carry with him long after the event ended.